So territorial differences across the UK play an important role in shaping the ways in which sovereignty is understood and the way in which the debate about sovereignty is playing out in the current referendum campaign. So in the non-English part of the UK, above all, you tend to see a much greater familiarity with notions of pooled sovereignty, because that's very much been the experience of those different territories living within the UK polity, but also having different local arrangements for government, which rely upon and have promoted more complicated notions of sovereignty as something that can be shared across different jurisdictions, different governing entities. Whereas in England, which has not been accorded any kind of independent system of governance, the older notion of parliamentary sovereignty that has been at the heart of the development of the British state, that remains strongest, or at least in some parts of England, it remains still very strong. And you tend to see that played out in terms of generally more Eurosceptic attitudes, the notion that the UK is in a sense giving something fundamental up, perhaps, in the context of being involved in Europe. Now, many people who believe in sovereignty are in this campaign arguing that actually the deal that David Cameron has negotiated preserves enough sovereignty in key policy areas. But there's a strong argument against that, which plays to this much older notion of parliamentary sovereignty. If there is a vote to leave the EU, then in terms of the domestic union, the most immediate issue, which could become a very pressing issue, would be Scotland. And so if the UK voted to leave, but a majority of Scots had voted to stay in, which is what opinion polls suggest is likely to happen in the case of Scotland, then it may well be that the SNP see that as an opportunity to once again table the question of Scottish independence. Now, it's not certain that they'll do that, and some people argue that the circumstances for representing the independence case are not that propitious now, but nevertheless there is an opening, and some who favour Scottish independence will see that as a moment, as an opportunity to reopen their sovereignty question. I think more generally as well, if in terms of not just Scotland but also Wales and Northern Ireland, and indeed for many voters who vote to stay in the European Union, for those voters who live in further away from London, particularly in the north of England, as well as those in Wales and Northern Ireland, indeed, then the question of being part of a state that is now set on a course to leave the EU will become a really big issue, and I think it is quite likely to feed into existing debates about how the governance of the UK ought to operate. And I think you could well see a renewed call for greater powers to regions or to cities in those parts of England that lie outside of the southeast London region. So questions of sovereignty have been an important part of the territorial politics that's developed in the UK. Ever since devolution, really, the question of where sovereignty should be exercised has been very important, particularly for those parts of the UK outside England that have been given some limited forms of self-government. And in those parts, in different ways, people have become accustomed to sovereignty being split, being held jointly between representatives of a government that they elect directly on the one hand in their own territory, and the UK, and the UK still having jurisdiction over key areas of policy. Now, in the case of England, the question of whether England ought to think of its own sovereignty in any separate sense from the UK Parliament and from government at the UK level, that's not been an issue in British politics for many, many years. It's very much been kept to the margins. But actually in the last couple of years it has begun to bubble up, and we've seen that particularly in the shadow of the Scottish independence referendum. So in England too, people are beginning to think about whether the question of some form of governance or some form of recognition at the level of England is now required. in British politics. So sovereignty is beginning to bubble to the surface even there. And the European question has become one of the ways in which the sovereignty issue now plays out, because it is deeply connected for people to the sense of the internal debate about how the domestic union should be organised. A vote to remain is much less likely to create in the short term a significant question about sovereignty within any single part of the UK. I mean, those issues may develop, but they will not be triggered, I think, by that vote. So in a sense, a vote to remain looks most likely to be a vote to keep things broadly as they are. But there are still issues that are very important for different peoples living within the UK. And one possible scenario here that is worth considering is that if there is a vote to remain, but a significant portion of the English have voted to leave. Now, mathematically, it may even be possible that a majority of the English could vote to leave, but the UK as a whole votes to stay. But even if a significant minority vote to leave, you then have a latent mandate for those politicians who will argue that actually the European question is not resolved, that our sovereignty remains at stake, at risk, by being part of the European venture. And it seems to me quite likely that you could have the European question bubbling along and still being quite resonant for many people in England, even if there is a vote to remain. I mean, if there is a vote to remain, then in the short term, the territorial issue within the UK does not break out. It does not look as if it's so acute. Though, one interesting possibility is if there is a vote to remain and there's also a significant portion of the English electorate that have voted to leave. So it could be that actually you get a situation where the English stay in, perhaps against the will of a majority, or at least a sizable minority, because of the votes cast by peoples living outside England. That's an interesting scenario and may actually have a bearing on the future development of the English question. But I think more generally, the sovereignty issue in relation to the EU is unlikely to go away. I mean, this will obviously represent, a victory for those who have argued for the Remain case, and particularly for David Cameron in terms of the deal that he's put before the British people. But the question of how the EU evolves and where a state like the UK that's not part of the Eurozone, what position it's going to occupy, and what that's going to mean for some key areas of domestic policy, that I think is unlikely to go away in British politics. So the sovereignty issue will bubble around, and there are future possible circumstances or crises that may well bring this back to the table.